And we begin in Iraq, where the United States, the United Nations, and the European Union are calling for peace in the crisis in Iraq and the de-escalation of violence. Tension built up when one of Iraq's key politicians, Muqtada-al Sadr, announced his sudden resignation from politics. The death toll from the outbreak of violence is being put at 30 and over 100 injured. We have a report.
For the second day in a row, violent protests have resumed in and around Baghdad's Green Zone between Pro-Sadr supporters and Iraqi armed forces. Unlike the first day, most of the Pro-Sadr supporters are seen carrying firearms. Since the protest started, medical sources say at least 30 people have been killed and hundreds more reported wounded. Tensions in Iraq heightened shortly after a powerful Shiite cleric, Muqtada-al Sadr, said he was quitting politics, and chaos spread in Baghdad's fortified Green Zone as Sadr's supporters stormed the Republican palace where cabinet meetings are usually held, a move that was followed by fire and ongoing clashes. And it soon became clear that the Iran-backed coordination framework and the Zadrist movement had started to exchange fire. The Iraqi security media cell says the Green Zone was targeted by 4 rockets. Meanwhile, a spokesman for the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, says he is following the protests in Iraq with concern. Mr. Guterres has appealed for calm and restraint and urged all relevant actors to take immediate steps to de-escalate the situation and avoid any violence. He also says all parties and actors must rise above their differences and engage without further delay in a peaceful and inclusive dialogue on a constructive way forward. Also, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Alina Romanowski, says the unrest in Iraq is disturbing because they are hampering on the operation of Iraqi institutions. She urged all parties to remain peaceful and refrain from acts that could lead to a cycle of violence.
And to help us have this conversation, we're joined from Belgium by Collins Oweke, who is a global affairs analyst. Thank you for joining us, Collins Oweke.
A pleasure to be with you, Precious. Thank you for having me.
Let's take a look at the announcement by al-Sadr. He's a very crucial figure in Iraq's politics. He's probably one of the few persons, if not the only person in Iraq, that has that kind of following and influence on the people. But do you think that he actually wanted to resign? What's your thoughts on that announcement?
Mr. Sadr's announcement is essentially a political statement. It wasn't a resignation. It is a political action with the purpose of energizing his base more and actually setting them out to help to achieve some of the political objectives that he has, namely total control of Iraq. Now, let's not forget that in the last election that took place, which is nearly 10 months ago, and since then no government has been formed, his party actually won the majority of seats in parliament. So, as a matter of fact, he was supposed to have the upper hand in setting the political agenda of Iraq going forward. But that has not happened. That has not happened because the combined forces on the other side of the political spectrum have, done everything they can to frustrate him. And that frustration is what actually led to this political action that he took now, which he tagged resignation. But it is far from resignation.
But I want to go back to the statement you made about the elections last year. He won about 73 seats, but he won the major seats, but that's not enough to form a government. His rivals also didn't have enough seats to form a government. So they have a situation where right now, both him and his rivals cannot form any government. Al-Sadr has refused to form a coalition government. But what do you think, what is the path for him in terms of getting a majoritarian government?
Well, you have asked the question, you have answered it at the same time, because even though his party won the majority of votes, he didn't win enough to form a government. So which means there is a hung parliament, and therefore a coalition is inevitable. Now, that coalition is not happening because he's been frustrated from the other side. And then on the other hand, and that is another curious twist in this whole saga, his MPs, his member of parliament, who helped in winning the majority, well, not the majority, the most votes, actually resigned from the party. So which means that even that, majority votes that he won at the time has actually thinned down. So he is in a quagmire, and the only known way out of this is for a new election to take place.
And we're not seeing that happening in Iraq anytime soon. Neither is that. And I want to bring in Libya as well, because the situation is sort of also very similar in Libya, where we've seen crises erupt on the streets as well. There is also a UN-recognized leadership in Libya, but there is another government in the east by way of parliament, of that country. Both countries became politically unstable after US-led invasion, and their leaders were who were termed dictators were taken out. But when you look at both countries, how do you think? Do you see a path to democracy once again? And how do you mediate? What is the solution to getting there?
Well, like they say in peace talks, there is always a possibility of peace. And in the interregnum, where there is no peace, it therefore means that the time for peace is yet to arrive, is yet to arrive. And that is exactly, how you could possibly describe the situation in both countries, Iraq and Libya. Now, ultimately, Libya is ungovernable at this moment. Iraq has also been ungovernable for, as a matter of fact, since 2003, as a matter of fact. And so it is a continuation of that aftermath of, U.S. invasion. Now, the only way that things can move forward is essentially to form a government of national unity. Now, that government of national unity has got to have elements of all the political actors, but then they will be confronted with, the question of who heads that government. So, essentially, when no one is willing to, make way for the other, you continue to have this. But I believe the situation in Iraq is even more complicated, because the talks of a government of national unity is not even on the table. And so in Libya, that was the situation at some point, even though the splits continue to be there.
And for both countries, for example, in Iraq, Al-Sadr doesn't want the influence. He came to popularity because he has always said he doesn't want the influence of the U.S. and Iran in Iraq, and that's how he came to popularity. But in a place like Libya, the U.S. seems to have this policy of ambiguity. There is really nothing specific in its policy towards Libya. And so one wonders, how do you de-escalate the crisis when one country says we do not want the influence of foreign governments, and the other, the foreign governments sort of have a policy of ambiguity?
That policy of ambiguity, of course, is deliberate. It is deliberate because obviously the Western Alliance, led by the United States, have learned their lessons from previous interventions. So it is, to put it crudely, what they are essentially doing now is letting the people of Libya and letting the people of Iraq to their own devices after their action had led to the country disintegrating and deteriorating. Now, it will surprise me, of course, if behind the scene and behind this policy of, ambiguity, that efforts are not being made from Washington to actually install, a government that is amenable to the whims and caprices of the United States of America. I think the Western Alliance, particularly the United States of America, has got to now face the reality and see very clearly that Mr. Sadr appears to be the only one that can head that country and peace will return. They will then have to deal with the nitty-gritty of him being the political leader of Iraq. But if that doesn't happen, it doesn't look like Iraq is moving from one position to the other.
We'll continue to follow developments in both countries closely. Thank you so much for your thoughts. Always a pleasure, as always. Global Affairs Analyst Collins Owenke.
Thank you for having me.